Hello and welcome to the Masonic Authors Guild International. This is Robert L.D. Cooper with Mark A. Tabbert. We are MAGI. Our mission is to promote the highest standards in education, research and publications relating to the global phenomenon of Freemasonry. Fraternal Claims: The Brotherhoods of Robert Burns by Professor Gerard Carruthers of the University of Glasgow. Abstract. This essay suggests that a part of Burns' biography that can appear rebarbative, his male identity, is also a crucial space of networking in the poet's career. His fraternal networks include, in the first place, the exemplary ideological spaces of 18th century Scots poetry, including the Jacobite leanings of predecessors such as Allan Ramsay, Burns's membership of the Crocallan Fencibles, his profession as an exciseman, and his place as a militiaman in the Dumfries Volunteers. These latter three locations represent certainly complex spaces, but previous biographical readings of them tend to underplay these as the positive, imaginative spaces of creativity which are suggested in this essay. It is the argument here also that more critical attention needs to be paid to Burns's fraternal spaces to understand the configuration of patronage in his career and to bring into sharper focus a reading of gendered space generally in the poet's work. End of abstract. In the 21st century, Burns's masculinity remains a strong impediment to the recuperation of the writer in his full historical context. Burns the exciseman, Burns the militia volunteer, Burns the Freemason, Burns the Crocallan Fencible. These and other iterations all potentially represent Burns the rebarbative alpha male. However, there have been those who seek to be apologists for the poor beset bard, at least in the first two of these roles. Burns the taxman spoiling folks' fun and Burns forced into political loyalism are read as compromises for his real ideals. For instance, William Stewart, in his book Robert Burns and the Common People, published in 1910, joins together a high-pitched cadence incorporating Burns's own words in the following passage. Quote, "When the official coercion was applied, as it was bound to be, he made his submission, and democracy's perhaps greatest voice was stifled at the moment when democracy had most need of it." That, to me, is the real tragedy of Robert Burns. In his soul he was humiliated, and he was a proud man, this peasant. Burns was a poor man by birth, and an exciseman by necessity. But, I will say it, the sterling of his honest worth no poverty could debase, and his independent British mind might bend. It could not subdue. End quote. Male authority positions, so the inferences run, are rebarbative spaces too for the poet. Few writers have had such judgmental biographers as Robert Burns. The old discredited notion of alcoholism, the moral turpitude generally, that was such a keynote of early treatments, have given way over the years to the special pleading such as is frequently heard among Burnsians. Quote, "He was no worse than any other men of his day," close quote, and the idea that his militia volunteering was a panicked reaction to the government harbouring doubts about his political beliefs. Biographically, and in ways that require explicitory engagement with the work itself, new paths remains to be found that avoid the old and slightly newer games of blame and praise for an individual now dead for 220 years. This essay brings into focus the 4 areas of Burns's maleness mentioned above in relation to his artistic career, arguing that what we see in all cases are, in some ways, spaces of enablement. In one sense, such a proposition is axiomatic, since poems, songs and letters are produced out of and in the context of these male identities. But it remains not only a peculiar phenomenon of Burns's criticism, but of Scottish criticism too, in ways that are only fairly recently beginning to shift, of reading the lesser, imperfect productions of Scottish literature, comprised as so much of its history is, so the argument goes, by deformed national status. To return to the axiom, what we have is what we have, and we should expend our energy reading that material rather than producing counterfactual noises about what might have been if only Burns and Scotland had not been culturally, politically and historically so compromised. Feminist criticism and gender criticism more generally have been slow off the mark with Burns, perhaps because the man who makes at least 5 women pregnant on at least 13 occasions is thought to be a hopeless case or too much of a sitting duck. As well as the poet's personal behaviour, his bawdry is also thought to be pretty distasteful to many Burnsians themselves through the 19th century and down to the 21st century. One of the most remarkable cases here is the private print edition of 1911 of the Merry Muses of Caledonia, originally written in 1799 by the editor of the Burns Chronicle, Duncan McNaught, the raison d'etre of which is to dissociate the poet as far as possible from its production. The publication carries an introduction signed Vindex, meaning defender or protector, one of the most explicit or frequent attempts by the Burns movement to throw a cordon sanitaire around their bard. In the interests of fairness, however, it should also be added that Duncan McNaught makes a much more positive contribution than this generally to the Burns studies of his day. Instead of denial, some critics have attempted to suggest a link between Burns's sexual libertarianism and his political radicalism. However, such a claim is open to some challenge. The cultural roots of Burns's bawdry lie in traditions that are, if anything, more aristocratic, or at least have to do with male drinking club society, often of the hedonistic Tory variety rather than with demotic politics of any kind. For instance, Holy Willie's Prayer, written in 1785, with its canting, hypocritical Calvinist, comes from a line that, in Scottish terms, goes back through the Jacobite Tories via Allan Ramsay and to Archibald Pitcairn in the text, such as the poem A Lucky Spence Last Advice, written approximately 1718, and the play The Assembly, written about 1691. Its strain of bawdry goes back even further through the Cavalier culture from the 1640s to the 1680s, and again to the plays of Ben Jonson attacking the puritanical religious mindset. Burns's The Fornicator's Court of 1786 was never published in Burns's lifetime. It existed in 3 manuscript sources as well as in a privately printed book. Only a couple of dozen copies of this book were produced. Walter Scott owned one, and his possession of it speaks of one of many overlooked continuities between Burns and Scott. Bawdry passed around with drinks and tobacco in an exclusively male society. Yet again, with Scott's interest in the text, we have highlighted the aristo-cultural strain. This print version from the early 1820s might in fact be the best text we have for the poem, and it actually may derive from another, potentially superior manuscript now lost. This is not the place to go into detail, but the general point needs to be made that the careful iteration of the text and its transmission down to the circle of Scott derives most importantly from Burns's membership of drinking clubs such as the Crocallan Fencibles, formed in Edinburgh in 1795. Even as the Fornicator's Court is a text that predates the material in the Fencibles collection, the Merry Muses. The preservation of the superior Walter Scott text is the result of the tradition of Scots male sociability out of which it comes. This is all of boozy, frivolous, and at the same time a matter of some cultural pride. The point has to be made that the title of this Fencibles Club is a parodic of loyal militias of the period, and so it is. However, the further attempt to have this point suggestive of Burns's revolutionary politics does not hold much water. There were Whigs among the Crocallans, including Burns's printer friend William Smellie, whose political radicalism has been talked up, but on the basis of very slight evidence. Smellie retained the admiration until his death of such conservatives such as Sir John Dalrymple and Edmund Burke. Smellie was also responsible for the sadomasochistic initiation of Burns into another drinking club that left Burns relishing the exquisite pain of his inaugural thrashing. In response to this, one might say, radical political activity, my backside, or rather Burns's. Another Whiggish member of the Fencibles was Henry Erskine. Henry was a political liberal, but the sometimes cited enmity between Erskine and Henry Dundas, William Pitt's Home Secretary, was as much about the rivalries within the tight legal circles of Edinburgh, and probably much more so, as it was about the larger ideological politics of the 1790s. The Fencibles also included Peter Hill on his way to becoming one of the most respectable burgesses of Scotland's capital during the early 19th century period of wars between Britain and France. Burns's friend, Alexander Cunningham, close to the poet until his death, was likewise a Fencible, and the correspondence between the two men is notable for their plague on all your houses attitude to party politics and to foreign affairs. If we want to find a context for a song such as Why Shouldn't Poor Folk Mow, or that is fornicate, it is in this kind of attitude. The song, part of the collection The Merry Muses of Caledonia of 1799, which is probably to some extent the club songbook for the Crocallan Fencibles, begins, When princes and prelates and het-nedded zealot, all Europe hae set in a low, the poor man lies down, nor envies a crown, and comforts himself with a mow. And why shouldnae poor folk mow, mow, and why shouldnae poor folk mow? The great folk hae siller and houses and lands, poor bodies have nothing but mow. This cynical, disengaged outlook in politics is found again in Burns's poem The Rights of Women. Paynites or Woolstonecraftarians will look in vain here too for a particularly radical Burns. It begins, While Europe's eye is fixed on mighty things, the fate of empires and the fall of kings, while quacks of state must each produce his plan, and even children lisp the rights of man. Amid this mighty fuss, just let me mention, the rights of women merit some attention. These feminine rights, according to our jaunty narrator, are to be protected and treated with decorum and admired. Ah, sirrah, the majesty of women, concludes this narrator with more of the hot fervour of the French lover, and in turn to regal language, than that of the Jacobin. There is a remarkable consistency from the beginning of Burns's career as a poet through the 1790s in inhabiting male spaces of escape or fantasy, albeit these spaces have a real cultural purchase. Nowhere is this more true than in relation to his own biography as father of an illegitimate child. In May 1785, his family servant, Elizabeth Peyton, had given birth to the poet's daughter, and some months later, into 1786, he penned The Fornicator's Court. The scenario of this poem is a fantasy, upturned version of an ecclesiastical court of censure for fornication. In the text, condemnation is poured on those who do not proudly admit their enthusiastic sexual congress. It is a typical Burnsian tour de force of extended conceit, the kind of aesthetic deployment that is all too often simply not mentioned in Burns' criticism. Too often through the centuries, Burns' critics have not really seemed to like it all as much as when Burns was simply being clever or arty with words or ideas.
This podcast is for educational purposes and perhaps entertainment. While the Masonic Authors Guild International provides the most accurate information possible, listeners use the information at their own risk. This podcast and its contents are MAGI's and Professor Gerard Carruthers' property, as are all the opinions and information it presents. Professor Gerard Carruthers, Robert L.D. Cooper's, and Mark A. Tabert's views and opinions within the podcast do not represent nor speak for Freemasonry, any Masonic organization, their former or current employers in any way, shape, or form. MAGI, Carruthers, Cooper, or Tabert will not compensate you in any way whatsoever if you ever happen to suffer an inconvenience due to the information herein contained.